Hi, Nicholas. I'm recording here my audio feedback on your Literacies of Struggle paper, and my hope is that this feedback will be useful as you're moving through your final project and thinking about how the work that you do in that final project contributes to or explains the particular literacy of struggle associated with Abalashai or Chingala Migra. So my comments here are not meant as like evaluative or assessment comments. Rather, I'm going to highlight some of the moments that I think you were saying something particularly strong or coherent or effective, and then also some of the moments where I was left with questions that I would wish you to answer more fully or deeply. And my aim in breaking out the comments in this way, both things that I think are working really well here and the things that leave me wanting more as a reader, my hope is that doing it in that way is going to kind of help you just kind of make sense of what you've done here in a way that lets you move through that final project in a way that makes it more a comprehensive part of the class as a whole for you. Just to say, just in general, off the bat, I really liked this. I thought you did a really smart and interesting job. You made a lot of good links and thought carefully about what's going on. So, basically, you first define literacy as a struggle in a very broad way. You say their purpose is to highlight and educate others on the stressors that a particular subgroup in society are exposed to, and how this affects their lives and expectations in a structured social environment. The purpose of these literary works is to bring light to a topic that may not have been considered regarding how unfairly our system of functioning is weighted toward oppression. Help individuals understand that there are others that suffer as they do, and understand where our own personal sense of emotions towards social and personal issues stem from, and relate these to the sufferings of others. Which is a lot. That's a lot. And you do work a little bit later to kind of try and narrow it down somehow. It's a lot. And at the same time, I think you're really hitting a lot of important stuff. Literacies of struggle have something to do with speaking to members of non-minoritized groups to help them understand what it's like in some way, or to help them / us understand what how the system that we live in it maintains oppression or minoritizes people. And then also at the same time they're internally directed. They're for and by members of minoritized groups to help one another feel and understand suffering, and to relate more broadly. So I think you're actually hitting on things that are probably all important things. What I don't see here yet, which is interesting, you do come to this a little more, but I don't see here like a sense of like actively changing society. And I wonder about the struggle part of literacies of struggle. So this is sort of, this way of talking about it is very much about representing struggle. And I'm curious whether you also see literacies of struggle as ways of accomplishing struggle, if they themselves are part of the struggle. And you kind of look at a few of the ways that literacies of struggle can look very different. And that latter one does kind of move a little more into that more active. A text can urge its readers to stand up and participate in a movement against a particular oppression. And I think here, one of the things that might be interesting to think about is, does it matter that what Harjo is doing is she's writing a book of poetry? Now, there's a prose introduction that we read together, but it's a book of poetry, and she's writing it as a Native woman, as an indigenous woman. And that Ratcliffe, what she's doing is she's writing a book of theory. We read an article from that book, but you're right, it's a whole book. And in that book, she's writing as a white woman who's seeking to be an ally Does it matter that these subject positions are so different? And if so, how? How does that shape the way that we read these texts, the way we think about how they are and are not participants in literacy as a struggle? And how does the difference between poetry versus theory as genres of writing matter for how these texts participate in literacy as a struggle? And also, how does the difference between writing as an indigenous person and writing as a white person about the particular issues that each of these are discussing matter for the ways in which their texts intersect with literacy as a struggle? I'd also, one of the things I'd be looking for here is just a little more articulation of what exactly are literacies a struggle. And I know you come to Brant a little bit later to try and think through some of the literacies part, but it'd be helpful to have just a little more on, well, where is the literacy in literacies a struggle from the early on? So, and then you start off here by talking about Ratcliffe, and I think, quote an important moment in her text where she's talking about the relationship between speaking and listening, and the way that these are gendered differently, and you follow that up by offering some kind of unpacking exactly of what's at stake there. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is your response to this is to say, it's important on the one hand to recognize that there's a set of oppressive relations there, and also to recognize that even those oppressive relations, they actually harm everyone. They are both oppressive and harmful to the oppressor as well. And I think that's a really important point about how oppression works. And I also kind of find myself wondering, okay, but so how is this about or part of a literacy of struggle exactly? So I'm looking for like a little more tie-in here as a reader. You say this creates an unending spiral, cannot be corrected unless both sides are able to realize what's happening, make a conscious effort to stop acting in a way that's harmful to both sides. And you say this is a primary aspect to literacy as a struggle. So when progress is made, both sides of an argument need to be able to realize what is happening and correct actions to reflect the progress that has occurred. I kind of want to push you a little more here, on the both sides, which on the one hand, I think is compelling and probably broadly correct. And on the other hand, I'm like struggling to see what exactly makes this way of thinking literacy a struggle. Why is this a literacy a struggle or part of a literacy a struggle and not something else? So similarly, when you kind of turn to Harjo, you turn to this powerful moment, and she is such a powerful writer. And you kind of close your discussion of her with this long quote, not long quote, but with this quote that you then follow up and talk a little bit about what's going on. And the enemy who pressed guns to our heads to force us to Oklahoma still walks in the mind of the people. And one of the things I want to kind of ask you about there is, well, what does that quote do? What does that moment do? Right? You say it directly speaks to how systematically and persistently the Native American people were oppressed, etc. And I think I think you're right. I think that's exactly what's happening there. And what does that do to readers? What does that ask readers to feel or see or want? It seems to me like when we think about literacy as a struggle, we have to be able to think beyond just what is being said at the level of like semantic content, to also be asking what's being done through the saying. How is the saying rhetorically active on and in us? How does the saying shape us? I would want to, I think when you turn to Brant to talk about literacy as a struggle, I would just kind of want to hear more. Cool, but what is literacy here? Brant is really in a lot of ways, our linchpin for thinking about, well, what is literacy in the first place, in order to be the anchor of literacies of struggle. And I'd encourage you to just kind of think more about what literacy is, and on that basis to kind of return to that effort to define what literacies of struggle are. Ansel Dua to me here feels a little kind of dropped in. I think you drop her in at a good spot, and I think you choose a good moment in her text to drop in. And I think you kind of like usefully articulate the systematic character of what she's saying, but I would kind of want to see you work that in a little, like just from a writerly perspective. I think that's something you could work in more fully. So here it seems like the theory of literacies of struggle has already evolved a little bit from where it started. They're an attempt to achieve equality. How do they do that? They shed light on issues that people normally do not think of on a daily basis. And we want to be a little careful there, right? Because the people who don't normally think of a lot of this stuff are maybe people like you and I who are privileged to not have to think about a lot of these things. But of course, a lot of the things under discussion are things that minoritized communities don't have a choice to not think about every day. So we want to be a little careful with that way of talking about it. But the point of achieving greater equality by shedding light, by making things known, that seems really important to this definition. And I think I like your follow-up. Their constant push towards a better future through personal testimonies and expressions of individuality that are hard-pressed to reach the eye of the public because of the exact oppressions and inequality that they're protesting. And so this notion that literacies of struggle work towards equality, and the very equality that they're working for, the very inequality that they're working against, makes it harder for them to be heard. And I think that's a really important and interesting thing, especially as you're coming through the final project, to be thinking about like what it means for some voices to be harder to hear in public fora than others. And that's something we've talked a lot about this semester. So I encourage you to kind of keep this thought in mind, and keep in mind like what you, from where you're standing, can do to boost or amplify some of the voices in the different literacies of struggle that you find most interesting or compelling or important. Now, in your discussion of Chinguelet Migra, you're talking really about the movement from a kind of an outside perspective. Here, I mean, obviously later, in your own work and for the course, you've looked at it a lot more at what the movement says and does. But right now, you're kind of looking at it at this point from the perspective of like what scholars are saying about it. And I think it's really important when we think about literacies of struggle to be able to think, okay, well, there's what scholars or historians or journalists say about different movements, and then there's also the rhetoric, the discourse that the movements themselves are producing, and those seem like they're important, different in important ways. So I want to encourage you to think more about the differences between how Chinguelet Migra movement members or movement actions, protests, etc., self-represent, and how they're represented by scholars, even very activist scholars like Paik. This idea that what's at stake in fighting for a better immigration policy is fighting dehumanization. And what's at stake for a lot of people is different kinds of religious. I mean the religious in like a good sense for those people, like religious commitments even to becoming more human. So, for instance, that's a scholar's view looking at the history of resistance to the dehumanization of immigrants. But what does it look like from the discourse produced by the movement itself? is that a literacy struggle, or is that part of the literacy struggle? Why or why not? And how is that different from the view of the scholar, the historian, the journalist? I think it's useful that scholarly thinking has helped you to think about the structures of our society. I think that's actually really important and useful. So I just want to be clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't think in that way at all. It's just that I want to also encourage you to come back to the movement's own rhetoric. Come back to what is the movement itself saying about the suppression of minorities. What is the grassroots movement of ideas, right? So what is the grassroots movement of ideas? And I think this is kind of where you're coming to. Some of the things I'm saying are some of where you are kind of coming to at the end. You say, before I stated that literacy is a struggle, we're meant to highlight the struggles of individuals and showcase how unfairly minorities are treated. I now understand that this vocalization of prejudice comes from an institutional standpoint and often is directly addressed through protest movements. And so I think, and I'm skipping the part that's a little bit tautological, but yeah, so this vocalization of prejudice comes from an institutional standpoint, often is directly addressed through protest movements. So how are protest movements part of making justice? And you do start to think about this. These works of literacy aim to aggressively make a statement regarding inequality, not just show how something is unfair. And then you try to kind of think through what's at stake in that. And you talk about the complete removal of humanity for anyone who happens to be undocumented. And I think now you're starting to get into the framing that Chinguelela Migra itself offers. Does that kind of resonate? And this is where I want to make sure, as you're moving through these final moments, that as you're thinking about what the communities of writers and activists that work diligently to achieve a more accepting future, what they themselves are saying, and how you can do whatever seems right from where you're standing to contribute to or explain the literacies of struggle in which members of the Chinguelela Migra Abolish ICE movements are participating. So just to reiterate, I really enjoyed this, Nicholas, and I'm glad you're thinking about it in these thoughtful, careful ways. And I look forward to reading some more of your work soon. And thanks.